If you knocked on a black person's door, you just invited them to church and left. You didn't teach them discussions. That was the policy. Wasn't good enough, so I ended up going to BYU, Idaho, Ricks College. And I ended up becoming the vice president of the student body there, which was a great experience. Got to meet President Kimball, spend about an hour with him. After college, I got hired on with the CIA.
I just remember having the very distinct thought, I didn't want to marry someone from Utah. I felt the culture was very, very different. I didn't like it.
There were some guys that were not return missionaries that would put masking tape over their legs, their lower thigh, just above the knee, to make it look like they had the garment on.
There's this sizing up that we do in the church. It's like, are you as holy as me? Like,
Yes,
Yeah,
most
What?
definitely. I told Dan, I said, look, I'll go to church with you, I'll support you, but if you want to pay tithing, you pay tithing. I'm not paying tithing.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guests are from the UK. We met Dan and Wendy Lingren. They found me on the internet, and I met with them, and they're just the sweetest couple. And I'm just so excited to share their story with you guys. So stay tuned for this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. Everyone has a journey they're walking. And along that road, we are met with potholes, road bumps, rain, storms, and sometimes just fog. But through it all, we're really just looking for one thing: clarity. Clarity so we can walk with confidence in that next step. There's one source I run to for that clarity. In the darkest of nights, Jesus offers me light that shines through even the thickest storms. Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we find clarity through the one who saves us all. Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guests are Dan and Wendy Lingren. And Dan and Wendy are all the way from the UK, which I think is awesome. And so we're super excited to have them on the podcast this week. So go ahead and introduce yourself, guys, and tell everybody a little bit about yourselves and how old you are. And I already told them where you're from, so.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see outside the window here. It's dark already because we're 7 hours ahead of you on the mountain time. But I'm Dan Lingren, and I'm 68 years old. I feel 38, but my hairline tells me I'm 68. So I was raised as a Catholic, went to Catholic school, was an altar boy, thought about becoming a priest when I was a young man, and then eventually went into high school and started discovering girls. But during my high school years and teenage years, the concept of religion and Christianity there were a lot of things that were unanswered in my mind that I'd learned from the Catholic Church. And I would get together with some friends that were also Christian, and we'd have like little Christian discussion groups. And still, a lot of those things were unanswered. I still felt like I was kind of searching for a religion that fit well for me. And it wasn't until after I graduated from high school, my father, who was an airline pilot, transferred from Denver, Colorado to Salt Lake City. And the reason he did that was he had been kind of preached a little bit by his dentist whenever he was having dental work done, who happened to be a member of the church. And this dentist kind of piqued his interest enough where he decided to transfer to Salt Lake and really investigate the church while he was flying out of Salt Lake City. And so our family moved down there and started taking lessons from the stake missionaries. And during that time, Utah was not a full-time mission, so we just had stake missionaries teaching the gospel. And so we had them in our home for probably about 8, maybe 10 weeks. And of course, gave us the challenge to read the Book of Mormon, which we did. And then we went through a fasting period and felt like we all kind of got an answer that the Book of Mormon was true and the gospel was true and the things they were teaching was true. And so I joined the church right after my 19th birthday and really felt good about it. Felt like the questions that I had as a young man and a young boy were finally opening up in my mind. It felt like going into a dark room and throwing on a light switch, and everything was illuminated for me. And so a year later, I turned in my papers to go on a mission, and I ended up serving in the Florida Tallahassee mission. And I was really excited about it. And I remember a couple of things before I went on my mission was one of the, I don't remember who said this, but they said that it was one of the church leaders, general authorities, that said, a mission is 2 short years of your life, but you have the rest of your life to think about it. And it really impregnated on my mind. And I felt like to go on a mission, I really needed to use my time wisely. And another, I think it was David O. McKay that said, if as a missionary you memorize a scripture a day, you'll have a photographic memory at the end of your mission. And so I kind of strive to do that while I was on my mission. And I was really good at scripture chase. Whenever we had zone conferences, we would always set aside like half an hour for scripture chase. And I dominated those, at least after about 6 months of being on my mission.
He bragged to me that it got so that when he would go to zone conference, some of the missionaries, if they saw that Dan was there, they would just close their scriptures and not even try.
Well, I don't know if it was that bad, but I was pretty good at it. And so I served in different leadership roles as a missionary, and I loved my mission. I loved going out there. Um, I served as a district leader or zone leader, and the thing I enjoyed more than anything, I served as a trainer, and so I got to train 4 brand new missionaries, which was a great experience. On my second tour, my second assignment as a missionary, I ended up in Waycross, Georgia. Now we're in the Bible Belt area on this mission, and I got hit by a car while I was riding my bike. After it was getting kind of late at night, so we were riding back to our apartment, and I got hit by this car. And when that happened, I remember hearing a large crash, kind of like if you remember what galvanized trash cans sound like when you bang them together. You're probably too young for that, but they make a loud
Galvanized trash cans.
they make a loud crashing noise, and that's what I heard, and that's what the noise was from the car impacting me on my bicycle. And I flew over the car, but I remember the spirit whispered to me that if I relaxed, everything would be all right. So I flew over the car, landed on the asphalt, and slid for quite a distance, scraped up my head, and my leg was badly damaged. Ended up going to the hospital. I knew that I was hurt pretty badly. I put my hand up to my head, and it was covered in blood. So I thought, well, if I see my companion, I can see by his facial expression how bad it's going to be. And when he came running up to me, it looked like I was in a death sentence. So anyway, they hauled me off to the hospital, and they ended up knowing that my leg was needing surgery after a few weeks, that it was gangrene was setting in. And I got shipped back to Salt Lake City to have surgery at the Salt Lake Hospital, or the LDS hospital. And then after recovering, I think I was back for maybe 4 or 5 weeks.
And I mean, this is kind of an important
Yeah.
part of the story you should tell.
So the doctor, prior to surgery, said that night, Dr. Swenson was his name, he was LDS, and he said that they were planning on cutting out the tissue, the dead tissue out of my left leg, and then trying to sew it back together, before sewing it back together, do a skin graft. So they'd have to take a skin graft from my hip and then place it into the tissue where they removed. And he said the thought came to him that if they were able to give me a muscle relaxant, maybe they could pull it together and stitch it back, and that would save a lot of recovery time and the possibility of rejecting the skin graft. And he said he had that like in a dream that night, and so the next day that's what we did. And it actually worked really well. There's a wide scar on my left leg, but it healed up, and I was able to go back to the mission field. In fact, the stake president asked where I wanted to go because they could send me anywhere. And I said, well, the Lord called me to Florida, Tallahassee. That's where I want to go. And so that's where I went. And had a great time on my mission. I really enjoyed it. It was a great experience. I think it was a very strong character building experience as well.
So when you were raised Catholic, what was your relationship with Jesus Christ like? Like, what was your understanding of who Jesus was?
I knew that Jesus was the Savior and the Son of God. At least that's, even though the Catholicism believes in the trilogy, I still felt like Jesus was the Son of God. God was our Heavenly Father, but God was their concept was God was so vast he encompassed the entire universe, but so small he could dwell in our hearts. So it was very vague understanding. But Jesus was a little more tangible since we had the New Testament. So I always felt a connection with God and with Jesus. And it was very comfortable for me in the Catholic Church, even though there were a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah. So then did you feel like you were growing in your relationship with Christ when you joined the LDS Church?
Great, a great amount.
Mhm.
So yeah, I felt like again it was just a wealth of information that all clicked, and it just fit perfectly like a puzzle. And so I was very happy about that. I felt like I've got all the answers now. Everything is right with the world.
Okay. Okay. All right. So go ahead and continue. So you get home off your mission. What next?
Get home from my mission, get rejected by BYU because my grades weren't that good, even though I
Okay.
served a
I
great
got
mission.
rejected by them too.
And I thought, I was always told that if you do a great job on your mission and get a letter of reference from your mission president, I had two mission presidents, so I got two letters of references. Wasn't good enough, so I ended up going to BYU, Idaho, Ricks College, and
Mm.
which was a great experience as well. And I ended up becoming the vice president of the student body there, which was a great experience. Got to meet President Kimball, spend about an hour with him.
You ran against Marriott's nephew.
Yeah, that's true. The guy that I ran against for executive vice president was a nephew of the Marriotts.
JW, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it was a neat experience, and the best part was getting to meet my wife. It took a while to get together, but we did meet there.
I was only 18. I wasn't quite ready to get
Really get
married or
serious,
get
yeah.
serious.
You know how
Yeah.
return missionaries are. They're ready to settle down and move forward. We got a mission to do.
Right.
But it was a great experience. I really enjoyed Ricks College. And after college, I got hired on with the CIA. And Winnie and I ended up getting married. Interesting story on that was so I was in Virginia, Winnie was in Denver, Colorado, and we were getting married over Labor Day weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of our family in Denver was a bishop. He was going to perform the marriage because the temple wasn't there at the time. The temple in Virginia was the Washington, D.C. temple. So we met with my bishop, or I did, and said, based on the handbook, you can get married in Denver and come to Washington, D.C., and then be sealed, no problem. So that got signed off by the bishop in Virginia and the one in Denver. And then when we got to Virginia to get Wendy's temple recommend, the stake president said, no, that's not the way the guideline reads. And so we had to cancel
Our
our
temple ceiling.
our temple sealing,
Yep.
and then we had to go to the upper courts. We actually had our bishop in Virginia fought for us and went to the temple presidency and got the stake president overruled, but it took a month
But
to
you can
resolve
just
that.
imagine the buzz.
Yeah,
Oh, they can't get married in the temple.
yeah,
Because everybody assumes that you're sinning if you don't get
yeah.
married.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Mhm.
anyway, we had a great career in the agency. Like I said, we traveled. Our first assignment was in Germany. We used to go to East Germany when it was still under Soviet control. We would take what they called the midnight train. You had to pull the shades down on all the windows and take the midnight train from Frankfurt into Berlin. And then once you were in Berlin, you could cross Checkpoint Charlie and go into East Berlin, which was all Soviet controlled, and just go shopping and do whatever you wanted to do. But it was just fascinating experiences. We were in Frankfurt when the Frankfurt Temple was dedicated. We spent time in Africa. We spent time in Okinawa and Cyprus. Cyprus is a fascinating country too. It's where the Crusades were staged for the most part, and then we had Peter served his mission part of the time there, and
So there were a lot of really neat
yeah,
things to see while we were there. It was really fun.
we got to spend time in the Holy Land,
Yeah.
and then our last tour was England.
Mm-hmm.
But we've traveled the world,
Yeah. We've lived in a lot of places.
and so we've seen the church all over the world as well, and we've been members. So I've served in just about every capacity you can be in.
You were the branch president in
Yeah.
Cyprus.
Branch president in Cyprus, but all the other colonies besides a bishop. So supporting the bishopric, but only a branch president.
Yeah, only.
But we've been married for 40 years, going on 41 in September, and we have a very good marriage. And she's my best friend, so very happy that we
Awesome.
are able to meet.
I'm pretty amazing.
She and modest.
So humble.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe so, and Wendy, you can weigh in on this before we get into your background. What are some of your guys' perspectives? I mean, you've seen the church from all different perspectives because everybody always talks about Utah Mormons are really different than other Mormons and all these things. So, like, tell me your views on that because you've been everywhere.
Can I back up one more thing and just say one thing about my mission again?
Uh-huh.
So the two things when I joined the church, there were two stumbling blocks for me. One was
Oh, I know what you're
polygamy,
gonna
and
say.
the other was blacks in the priesthood. So while I was on my mission, President Kimball announced on my about 6 months left on my mission that blacks were now going to be able to hold the Melchizedek priesthood. So I told my companion, well, before before I told my companion, so the policy in Florida, Tallahassee was if you knocked on a black person's door, you just invited them to church and left. You didn't teach them the discussions.
What?
That was the policy. And
Yep.
so I told my
What?
companion when that we actually heard it from a member on his radio, and so I told my
The
companion,
announcement
yeah, the announcement from
about
President Kimball,
being able to preach to.
not that to preach, but the blacks would be able to hold the priesthood.
Okay.
So I told my companion, I said, tomorrow morning, we're going to knock on the inner city areas and the black neighborhoods and start teaching. And he said, I don't think we can do that. I said, we're doing that. And that's what we did. And I remember one Sunday going to church shortly after this happened, a member pulled me aside in the foyer and said, you're not bringing any black people into church, are you? I said, they're coming. So you better get ready.
Good for you. Brigham Young brought the racism into the church, and I
Yeah,
think
there's
the
still a
church
lot
used
of,
to be very racist.
yeah,
Very. Yeah.
Well, and then you have Nelson coming forward and talking about how we need to not be racist, and I'm like, we're not really racist anymore. Why wasn't this being taught back in Brigham Young's time?
yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know too many LDS people that are against black people anymore. So I'm like,
Or
this
even if
would be
they ever
way
were, really.
Well, there were
right.
some.
I mean, I'm sure there were some, but
I'm
as
sure
a,
there's
as a
some.
as a group, I wouldn't think
No, I think, yeah.
that would be the case. But
Mhm.
um, anyway, going to your previous
Yeah,
question.
question about your observations about Mormonism all over.
So this is kind of interesting because I went to church. I grew up in Kittery, Maine. My mother was a single parent. She basically got pregnant in high school when she was a senior, and my brother was born after she graduated in June of 1960. She actually graduated in 59, so she got pregnant like probably right before she graduated, or
Her senior year.
her senior year. Anyway, back then you got married if you got pregnant. And so she married my father and had three more children in 4 years. So, I mean, she literally every year, my brother and I are the same age for 5 days because we're that close in age. In June,
Wow.
he's the 22nd, but he's 11 months older than me, and I'm the 17th.
Wow.
So, and then I have a younger brother that was born the next year in September, and a younger sister who was born the year after that in December. And when my mother was pregnant with my sister, I think she realized, okay, I'm just going to be pregnant every year until who knows how, when. And and my father, I don't know much about him, but I don't think he was around very much, and I don't think they had a good relationship. And so she filed for divorce. And back in the 60s, that was not done. Not really,
Very
not in
often.
any, whether you were a religious person or a non-religious person, people just didn't do that. There was a real stigma to getting divorced. And so we were, long story short, my mother, she joined the church in Vermont. The missionaries came knocking on our door. She was converted. She was baptized at the Joseph Smith Memorial Building, from what I understand. And or at least there was a church that was
Yeah, there's
near there.
a monument.
Yeah. And we moved back to Kittery. Her parents were in Kittery, and So the reason I say this is because I basically grew up in a small branch on the East Coast, very different than Utah. So here's my mother in the Mormon church. She's a single mother
Mhm.
of with 4 children. This is not something that you would have seen in Utah in the 60s. The people in the branch were very accepting of us and very kind and never made us feel strange. I always felt a little bit strange, especially when there was the daddy daughter dance, when it was time for me to be baptized. There was no priesthood holder in our home. So
Mhm.
we always felt a little bit weird, but it wasn't because they made us feel weird. It was just because we knew we were very different. And then I remember when I went to BYU. So I went to Rick's College first, and that's where I met Dan. And I went to Rick's for a year, and then I transferred to BYU. And I had tried to get in the nursing program at Rick's, but they had very few slots, and I was competitive, but I did not get into the nursing program there. So I just said, well, I'm going to transfer to BYU. And I just remember having the very distinct thought I didn't want to marry someone from Utah. I felt the culture was very, very different, and I didn't like it. So I feel like God hears those prayers because Dan is not a Utah Mormon and he grew up Catholic. So there's this thing that really it works because he didn't have that. He didn't grow up with that culture either, and that made us very compatible.
Compatible.
Yeah. But it's funny that in the ward in Virginia that we went to, it was very much like a Utah ward. So even though Virginia is on the East Coast, most of those people were from Utah. They were in Virginia because they worked for the federal government. The CIA actually recruited at that time. I don't know if they still do, but they recruited very heavily at
From
BYU because those people had to get a security clearance and they lived a pretty good life, and it was easier to get them through the security process.
Interesting.
So we had a lot of Mormons at the CIA, and so consequently in Virginia, in the ward that we attended, really, and we attended 2 wards when we lived there. First in Herndon, and then in Loudoun County, and you know. I noticed a big difference. They were Utah Mormons, and that's where it got, much more the Utah culture.
Mhm.
And I just remember thinking, this was why I didn't want to marry a Utah Mormon. I didn't want to be a part of that culture. It was
Can you
interesting that I had that thought at 20
right.
years old.
Can you maybe pinpoint maybe some of the things you noticed? I'm just curious if like you noticed any particular things.
It was the judging. It was, um, not wearing the right clothing, or like if
Mm.
you wear a skirt that was a little bit too short. I happen to kind of have long legs for somebody my height. I'm more legs than anything else, and so skirts tended to be shorter on me.
Mhm.
And I noticed this with my daughter too, because she's even taller and longer legged than I am. And we sent her to EFY in Southern Virginia University when she was 14. And she had the longest shorts that we could buy. And they made her go back to the dorm and change into jeans because her shorts didn't come to her knees.
in Southern Virginia is hot in the summer months. So
But yeah, those kind of cultural things.
yeah, the garment checking. So I don't know if you've heard
Yes, the
these
garment
stories.
checking.
I don't know if you heard these stories or not, but I knew back in Utah, because we joined the church in Utah, that there were some guys that were not returned missionaries that would put masking tape over their legs, their lower thigh, just above the knee, to make it look like they had the garment on. That I think that's a little bit about what you're talking about with the culture.
Very much. I'd never
I
heard that,
didn't
but
Yeah.
know that, but I understand the garment checking. I was one of those people that was doing that back then.
well, because you know why they do it? Because if they have to wear them, you do too.
Mm. Yeah,
If I
well, and
suffer,
it's
everybody
I
you
don't think
suffers.
anybody really likes them or finds them comfortable, but if they have to wear them, so do you. So you better have yours on, and if you're not, why aren't you wearing them?
I think for
Yeah.
a lot of people, it's that, there's this sizing up that we do in the church. It's like, are
Yeah.
you as holy as me? Like,
Yes,
Yeah.
most
what?
definitely.
Yeah. And
And we
that's what I
bring
was
it.
going to say.
Yes, okay, we're thinking the same thing then because
Mhm.
I don't think we should be sizing people up. I think when when the scriptures talk about righteous judgment, we're judging what is sin and what is not. It's not sizing people up. And that's
Exactly.
And same with
mhm.
temple attendance and same with home teaching or visiting teaching
Oh,
of
the home teaching
records.
and visiting teaching, or now it's ministering.
Yeah.
Boy, that was, yeah.
Another
I could
cultural
cite
thing.
some really
Yeah.
interesting examples, but I won't bore you with details. It's just, yeah, it's the constant establishing the pecking order. I'm up here. You're
You're
not quite
down
as good
here.
as
Yeah.
me.
Or if you're
I
the bishop, if you're the bishop's spouse.
Yes, if I remember when he was the branch president in Cyprus, people treated us differently, and I just remember thinking, why? Don't do
Right.
that. We're not we're not any different. I the Even you see that with the general authorities, how you're supposed to
Stand.
stand up
Yeah.
and stay standing until they sit down, and when they get
Yeah.
to leave first, and there's this whole thing that I don't.
Idolatry.
Yeah,
The red velvet chairs.
yes, and it just sort
Yeah.
of the pecking order and the hierarchy, and I just never thought that that would be something that Christ would find good.
No. Definitely not. Okay. So, did you feel like so let's kind of maybe fast forward into like you're getting older and you're still experiencing different did you feel like it was different in other states than in Utah?
Well, so we traveled mostly around the world. The
Mhm.
only states we lived in were when we were in college in Utah, and then
Mhm.
in Virginia, Northern Virginia,
Okay.
and but we did go to a military ward in Okinawa,
Mm.
and there was some there was some cliquishness there, but they were overall very, very nice, and I would say it definitely operated more like a Utah culture, but
Mm.
I didn't feel like it was quite like it was when I was in Utah
Yeah.
or
Mm.
in Northern Virginia.
Right. In
Yeah.
the military ward, the pecking order is now on rank. So depending on if you're an enlisted, that's one pecking order, or if you're an officer, that's another pecking order. And then
Interesting.
based on your rank is going to determine what type of house you have. And the house that we had in Okinawa was some of the best housing you could get. And that's just the way it worked with the agency I worked for. We had really good housing. And so I remember people from the war coming
Yeah.
over and like, what rank is your husband?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a bit awkward because when we were overseas, we were also not supposed to say who we worked for. And that was the
Mm.
thing. So it was awkward because they were like, "Well, women would come over and say, where did you say your husband works, or who?" And I'd have, and he was agency, and I couldn't say, "Well,
What
he's
department?
agency."
It was
So
always Department of
we just had to
Defense.
say he's a DOD civilian, is what I would say.
Mm.
But it would just be kind of like they were like, "Wow, that's something." We were young, and we would have a nicer house than people who'd been in the military for 20 years, or whose husband had been in the military for 20 years. These women would come over and go, "Wow, you're a lot younger than me. Why do you have a nicer house than I do?" Because in the military, as you progress upwards, you get better housing, your husband gets promoted.
Mm.
And so there was that pecking order even in the church, which surprised us. But
Yeah.
other than that, I didn't feel like it was. I mean, there was some garment checking for sure
Mhm.
because Okinawa, the weather was warm and people
Yeah.
wanted to be comfortable when they were outside, so they would wear. I would wear shorts when I would go for a walk outside. It was just too hot to have that extra layer,
Mhm.
and there was always kind of if somebody saw me in the grocery store, they would kind of say something. This one woman in our ward would say, "How come you're not wearing your garments?" And I'd say, "Well, it's hot." And I took them off.
That's really weird that we would ask people about their underwear, to be
Yeah.
honest.
I agree. I just have always thought it was so weird.
The thing is that, like, when you're in it, because I didn't think it was weird until I'm like, "Oh." So, like, when you're in it, you're just kinda like, "This is what we're supposed to do," especially the people who believe it's synonymous with God. Like, if you feel like it's
Yes,
synonymous with following God and you really wanna follow God, it's so hard to get out of the culture that is associated with following God. So,
right.
I can see where people come from on it, but it's not what Jesus taught us to do with our relationships with people. So
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
okay. All right, Wendy. So you already started giving us a little bit of your background. Anything else you want to tell us about your background? Maybe tell us a little bit about what Young Women's was like for you, things like that.
I had really good experiences growing up in the church. I mean, like I said, I grew up on the East Coast. I did go to high school in North Dakota because my mother did remarry when I was 12, and he was in the Air Force. So by the time I was 14, he got transferred to Grand Forks, North Dakota, and I spent all my high school years there. And Grand Forks was very different again from the culture in Utah. So it was a really nice group of people. And when the weather is severe, like North Dakota had very severe wind, cold, people, and it wasn't there weren't a lot of people. It was a small town, really. Grand Forks is not didn't at that time didn't have a large population, so people were nice to each other and helped each other out when it was cold. Cars wouldn't start, and it was a nice community, and so I didn't feel like the church culture there was negative in any way. So most of my time in the church, I had really good young women leaders. They were fun. They always try to assign the younger women to be your leaders, and so they were fun younger women who would have us over to their house and do slumber parties and learn how to cook or learn how to do hair. So there's a lot of really positive things, and I had to focus on that when I was first feeling um, like I had been lied to, really betrayed, and so I focused on the fact that had I not been a member of the church and not gone to Rick's College and BYU, I wouldn't have met Dan, and I don't really know, what my life would have been.
Very good.
So So
Yeah.
overall, my growing up in the church, I think, was a very, very good thing. And there's a lot of positive. It is a wholesome environment. There's no drinking. There's no smoking. You don't do drugs. You don't swear.
Well,
Um,
it used to be anyway. In your guys' generation, yeah.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We did grow up in a much different time. I mean, we don't have much time left, really, if
Yeah.
I think about it. But yeah, I feel fortunate that I had the upbringing. I liked the atmosphere of our church is still very traditional. The music is very traditional. I like the music. It feels very like normal and home. When we've
Yeah.
tried to find other churches to go to, the music is much more contemporary. I think that really works for people, but if you haven't grown up in that, um, it's hard to feel a spirit in that, you know. And I play Christian music on the radio when I was going to and from work when I lived in Northern Virginia, and
Mhm.
I love Christian music. The more contemporary, I could still feel spiritual listening to the words and things. But for some reason, when I would go to like a more contemporary church in the States, it tended to be in auditoriums, and it was dark, and they'd have screens up in the front, and it was
Mhm.
really loud music. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know, it just didn't feel
Didn't feel like
con
church.
it didn't feel like church. It didn't feel conducive to bringing the spirit,
Mhm. Yeah.
and, so that's been hard.
Yeah.
That's been the hardest thing is finding, organized worship that makes you feel like you're feeling the spirit, and I have had, um, some very distinct prayers answered, and, even just, having a daughter after 2 boys when he didn't wanna have any more kids.
Uh-huh.
I mean, we had the 2 boys 2 years apart, both born in October. Awesome. Everything went very well. I didn't have any problems, and I wanted to have a girl, and he just was not ready to have a third. And we got ready to put Logan into kindergarten. I think
Mhm.
he 6 or 5? I think he was
5
5.
when you got pregnant.
Yeah, and he finally said, "Did you still want to try for a girl?" And I mean, I prayed, I wanted a girl. And he said, if we try for a girl, I want you to know if it's another boy, I don't want to have any more. And I said, okay, I got one shot at this. So,
Did it.
I mean, our daughter was an answer to a prayer, but I've had very
Yeah.
physical manifestations, the times when you pray and you feel like someone's hugging you and you're all alone,
Mhm.
but you definitely feel a warm hug.
Mhm.
So I know that our prayers are listened to, and you know, I I am not I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater as some people do when
Yeah.
they find out that the church has not been completely honest.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get into your wake up, Wendy, go maybe tell us about, okay, so you're married now. Tell us about the callings you held as you got older and kind of the part the church played in your life at that point in your life.
It was the center of my life. It was
Mhm.
really what, and even though I worked and I was raising children, you build your schedule around, well, the kids have young men or young women, or they have primary. Now, primary was, by the time our kids were in primary, they were going on Sunday. I don't think we had primary during the week so much, but Haley had activity day for girls and the boys had scouts. So the most of the callings I had were either in primary teaching or in young women's. In When Haley was in women's, they had me be the Beehive advisor. I don't think I ever served in the Relief Society other than they asked me to teach from time to time, and I was a visiting teacher. So yeah, I was all in. I believed in the gospel, and I really, I felt guilty if I wasn't doing everything that I was supposed to be doing. I used to feel guilty about not getting all of my visiting teaching done if I didn't. I was pretty good at it, but then I had an experience where it was really bad, and I just decided I wasn't going to feel guilty for not doing visiting teaching anymore. And the best way to do that was just to tell them to take me off the list. I didn't have to do it. It wasn't a commandment, and I just said, not doing it anymore."
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's you guys were really faithful members for a long, long time. So kind of get into what changed. What were some shifts that you were having?
You kind of took us down this path.
I bit the apple.
Okay.
It was really it was during COVID
Yeah.
when they wouldn't let us go to church.
We were in South Korea at the time.
It was, and it wasn't really until
Oh,
we got home that, because we went to church in South Korea, they
We
had to
did.
shut it down there.
No, well, they
interesting.
did after a while. At first, we were going to church, and then when because COVID, we were there, and then COVID broke out kind of in September. They didn't start shutting it down really until
I was
January.
trying to remember when that happened, but it really wasn't until we got back from South Korea, and they were really in the States, they were really shutting things down. Nobody was
Right.
really allowed to go anywhere but
It
the
was just
grocery
virtual.
store. So we were supposed to do our study at home. They had sacrament meeting over
Mm.
um, the Zoom calls, and we were supposed to do our, like our come follow me lessons at home. It was self home study. And I just, I wasn't doing it. I just, you know, fell behind, and I thought, well, I need to get caught up. We're eventually going to go back to church, and I need to get caught up on my lessons. And so I did a YouTube search and said, come follow me, who's teaching, can I find, somebody that way. And I found a good, faithful Mormon couple that was teaching the Come Follow Me lessons. And so I'd been listening to them, and I went on one day to listen to some more of the lessons. And the YouTube algorithms being what they are, I think the first video they suggested to me was a Sandra Tanner video.
Boom.
And I kind of felt guilty. I'm like, oh, she's really saying some stuff that.
Let me stop you there. Just another story back to my mission. So that ties in with what Wendy is saying.
Mhm.
So I went to the mission home in Salt Lake City since it was an English speaking mission. And there was, I think, on a Thursday or Friday, we were scheduled to go to the temple, and we were going to go in the upper rooms, and it was going to be a really neat experience. And so we got informed and advised to, when we made our way from the mission home to the temple, the Tanners were going to be out there, or Tanner representatives handing out literature, and we were instructed not to take any of their literature, but to be very courteous and continue on our way to the temple. So anyway, sorry.
So yeah, I
Interesting.
don't know if you know who she is, but her
The
and her
name sounds
husband.
familiar.
Yeah, her and her husband have done a lot of research. I think it's called Lighthouse
Yeah.
Ministries.
Mhm.
And they were very faithful members of the church as well. I think she was a convert and her husband was a member his entire life. And she started talking about, the research that they were trying to do in the library. They were allowed to use the church library in Salt Lake at one point, and then at some point they wanted to talk to one of the general authorities, and the general authorities didn't like sort of the path or the direction they were going with some of their study, and so they wouldn't give them access anymore. But I didn't listen to a lot of her stuff in the very beginning because I just felt, we were always told not to look at anti-Mormon literature. And so I thought, well, this sounds like anti-Mormon. So I didn't watch the whole video of hers. But it did, again, bring up the YouTube algorithm brought up things from Mormon stories, and that led to resources like D. Michael Quinn, Grant Palmer. It brought up all these other people, and I remember thinking, well, these are just people that don't like the church. But I got curious because some of them were talking a lot about church history, and I do like history in general. I always liked history in school, and so church history was also interesting to me. And so I did start listening to some of it, and they had good resources. And then, I was feeling guilty again. I was listening to this stuff, and I thought, well, you're always told to go to the church website. And one of them had said, and I don't remember which one, if it was Dan Vogel or Grant Palmer, but they said, if you just feel comfortable going to the church website, if you feel like what I'm saying is, you don't know if it's true or not, feel free to go to the church website and look up the gospel topics essays, and you will find a lot of what I'm telling you is corroborated by the church. But it is very difficult to find if you're trying to find it on the church website. It's, you've got to really kind of dig in. And I did. And lo and behold, the church wasn't denying the rock and the hat. They weren't denying Joseph Smith's polygamy. And those were things that they hadn't taught. Not only did they not teach it when I was growing up, but they're not really talking about it at conference. They're not saying, we teach the Urim and Thummim, but by the way, he also had a rock and a hat.
So just to clarify for our audience, when you were a kid, you weren't taught that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. Is that correct?
Absolutely not. In fact, what I was taught, that it didn't start until they were leaving Nauvoo and going west.
Yeah, and that was because many of the men were killed off, or were in the Mormon battalion, and these women didn't have husbands, and so men were marrying these women in order to provide for these ladies. That's what we were taught, or that Joseph Smith entered into polygamy after his death, that these women were sealed to him afterwards. That's what I was taught growing up.
Yeah, we were very much taught that they were persecuted, and really, I even asked why were they persecuted, and was told that it was just, they drank coffee, they were a peculiar people, and so they were persecuted.
Didn't drink coffee.
Or because they didn't drink coffee. Yes, sorry. Sorry. They didn't drink. They weren't, they were peculiar. They were weird. And so they got persecuted, and they were asked to leave. There were probably other reasons why they were persecuted, but that was why we were told that all these men were killed for being Mormon. And then the women had to cross the plains. And that was when polygamy started. That's what we were both taught. He didn't join in until he was 19, but that was my entire upbringing, and all the way up until I was 59. That's what I was told. It wasn't, and we taught the youth in Sunday school in our church in North Carolina, in our branch. And we didn't have any lessons talking to the kids about Joseph Smith being a polygamist, or mention of any of his wives, and so we don't feel it's being taught today, really. They put it on the website, but it's not a part of the curriculum. And why is that?
So, and it's becoming more and more of the curriculum. They just recently added the new primary lessons about Joseph Smith being a polygamist. And so what we see here from your guys' story is that the narratives have changed so much. And so to any part of the audience, no matter what group you're in, Christian, Mormon, this nuanced Mormon space that we're in, this is why there's so much confusion, is because there is so many different narratives going around. And so, I mean, I'd encourage everybody to be a truth seeker because and
Exactly.
go to God and ask him because that's
Hmm.
how we're going to know because of all the crazy narratives that have been going on ever since the beginning. And it's changed and changed and changed to now we're teaching children that polygamy is of God. And that's
Yeah.
blows
Yeah.
my mind.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, I was very angry at the beginning. I was really angry, especially
Well,
because when
I
I
lied
looked on the
to.
church website and they weren't denying it, they
Right.
weren't.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so,
Well,
and
you feel lied to, and that's why. Sorry,
yeah.
Dan. What were you saying?
No, well, no, that Wendy was very angry, and I'm still true blue Mormon
Right.
during this time frame because I'm not doing the research that Wendy's doing. I'm working, and so part of me is like I need to help my wife come back into the fold because I see her kind of pulling away, and at
Hmm.
risk. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but to me, at risk was not only our relationship but eternal marriage because we're best of friends and we've been that way throughout our marriage, and this is something I value tremendously. And I remember this is after we got back to our home, and we were in San Antonio at the time when she first started kind of pulling away, and then we got to our home in North Carolina, and she was saying that she just doesn't believe it anymore, and wanted to leave the church, and it just tore my
But
heart out.
I did tell him, I said, look, I'll go with you, but I'm not going to pay tithing. I'm not going to have a calling, and I'm not going to give talks. I will go. I liked the people. I just wasn't going to stand up and lie about something that I didn't believe in. I didn't think that would be the right thing to do. And I certainly wasn't there to criticize anybody for their beliefs. Don't want to take that away from anyone. My mother is a believer. She's 83.
Yeah, my
And
my parents are believers, and they've been on 2.5 missions,
mhm,
and so dealing with parents who are still believers and not wanting to shake their faith
Hmm.
is a precarious position to be in
yeah,
as well. But back to
Right.
Wendy's, when she first started talking about leaving the church, and I felt like, well, if this is true, we're risking eternal marriage,
yeah.
and I want to be with you in the hereafter because what is this life all about if we're not going to be together in the hereafter? And so that was a very difficult time for me to go through that. But then as I started reading more about what she was reading and even bringing in some kind of counter anti-Mormon literature from other members of the church and reading through that and, not really addressing the points, it, started pulling me into that frame of mind as well. And to the point where in 2022,
Yeah,
we,
you were reading something,
there was a book, I can't remember the name of it now, but
a reason for
A
faith.
Reason for Faith. Yeah.
Yeah, by
So
Hales, I think it is,
could have
wasn't it?
been, I can't remember,
Mike Hales, or
but
anyway.
this woman writes this book and then talks to very well-respected, renowned church historians and doctrinal specialties and different categories, and so addressing all different types of topics. And it's an interesting book, but it just wasn't enough to really address some of the information that Wendy was coming across. So that was a difficult point,
Yeah,
but we ended up looking, coming to the point after a couple of years of study, thinking that, yeah, I think we can either stand our position and be excommunicated, or we can resign from the church and take control of our own destiny. And the way the church excommunicates people, it's almost a public shaming of that individual, especially from the ward or the
the
branch that
branch.
you're in.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
And I didn't feel like we needed to go through that. We felt strong about our position, and so we drafted up a letter of resignation and submitted, had it notarized, and submitted it, and then got taken off the records that way.
yeah. And then there were other things about the church. Just like I said, when I was first going through it, and I finally came to this realization: wow, I cannot believe I've been here all these years, and I did not realize that it's not true. And I told Dan, I said, look, I'll go to church with you and I'll support you. But if you want to pay tithing, you pay tithing. I'm not paying tithing. And the way I looked at it after I realized sort of different ideas of what tithing really should be, how it started and where it ended up. The gross blessings versus net blessings, the on your increase versus on your excess after you've met all of your, those kinds of things. I started thinking, I said to Dan, you don't need to worry about tithing. You're paid in full. So you can go to tithing settlement, not having paid anything for the year, and you can honestly say you've paid a full tithe because you paid a lot over the years, more than you really needed to pay. So, there were a lot of things about the church as an organization, really as a corporation, that
Yeah.
like I said, the more you learn, the more unhappy you become. So at some point, I just said, I'm just going to stop because it doesn't make you feel good.
Well, getting back to tithing, I mean, having separated from the church, it's kind of nice that you have that freedom now to pay tithing the way you want to pay tithing.
Yeah.
You want to contribute to whatever, whether it's St. Jude's or
Samaritan's
Samaritan's
Purse,
Purse, which
or
we're very fond of since it's in North Carolina. And they did a lot for the people throughout North Carolina through the Helene hurricane.
yeah,
But it gives you that freedom to distribute the money how you see fit, as opposed to giving to the church, which I don't know if you've seen the Ensign Peak Fund and all the information on that, where the church has in the stock market alone now an estimated 150 billion, maybe even more than that, and their total net worth is over 200 billion. And when you look at the church as a corporation where everything is assigned to the prophet, president of the church, so Russell M. Nelson is actually one of the richest men in the world because he has a net worth of over 200 billion. So it comes back to being a corporation. And we don't think that that's the way Christ would set up his church.
not really an honest one at that.
Yeah.
And I think about the question that I had to answer for every temple recommend. In the beginning, it was every year, and then they changed it to every 2 years. But one of the questions on there is, are you honest in your dealings with your fellow men? And that, when you find out that your church has not been not only not honest with you, but not honest in their business dealings,
Mhm.
Setting up shell companies, again, you just realize that it's not what Jesus would do. You
No.
start thinking about Christ and turning over the temples of
money
the
tables.
tables in the temple of the money changers. You start thinking, my gosh, I don't think he would be very happy with the way the church is managing their money.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I think it's grinding upon the face of the poor because tithing should be going to people who need it, not building up giant buildings and giant fancy buildings, by the way. And
And can't you
Yeah.
just imagine of the good things they could do? They could set up
oh,
what the Catholic Church has done with Catholic schools. The Mormon Church could have Mormon schools, parochial schools for children, and make it so that all the members of the church who didn't want to send their children to public school could send them to an LDS school. I mean, they have the money to do that.
they don't use
with
it
with
that
a
way
little bit
though.
of teaching about Jesus at some point in the day or throughout the day, sprinkled throughout the day. I mean, you think about the influence that
Mhm.
they could have if they used that money instead of just
Well, yeah.
letting it sit in a fund that they call a rainy day fund. But
Well, yeah, it's true. And I mean, they have LDS private schools, but the students are pouring, well, the parents of the students are pouring money into those schools. And it's very frustrating to find these things out where, I mean, I know single moms that the church is they either feel so stuck to the church because the church is giving them money, even though they're awake, or they feel like, there's the church isn't giving them the money they need and they're single moms and they need it. And so it's just
yes,
a
absolutely.
two-edged sword. Mhm.
Or have you ever cleaned the church building on a Saturday?
Right? So my parents say they used to actually pay people to clean the churches, and the
That's
churches
true.
stayed really
Yeah,
clean because
my,
they pay people, and they don't
my
do that anymore.
stepfather, that was his job after he retired. He worked for the church cleaning the
Mhm.
church every week. That was,
Yep.
just a part-time thing he did on the side to supplement his retirement.
Mhm.
They took that job away from him and they now make the members. And I thought to myself, you have that much money and you had to do away with that job?
Well,
Yeah,
the
and
same,
you're giving people jobs, like
yeah.
Yes.
Well, the same with, when I joined the church and when I served as a missionary, we taught that there wasn't a paid clergy in
Yeah.
our church. And you come to find out, well, the general authorities, the top 15 for sure, are making 180,000 or more a year, plus the benefits they get. They have the high-rise apartment building that are assigned apartments for each of them, and even
They
down
get
to,
a car
yeah,
allowance,
I
they
mean,
get a food
they're
allowance. I
making
mean,
a
it's
hefty six-figure salary,
it,
and many of
Mhm.
these guys have multiple homes, and several of them have homes in Heber Valley, which is a beautiful part of the country,
Mhm.
and they're not
it
cheap
was
out
it
there.
was shocking actually
Yeah.
because I
Mhm.
really respected. I remember even especially thinking about Uchtdorf.
Mhm.
You know, him being from Germany and thinking, wow, he left his home in Germany to come and serve God, and he's doing this for free. You know,
Well, he retired as a Lufthansa pilot.
I realize that, but he
Okay.
still left his home,
Yeah.
and and you know, I mean, living on a retirement income. I really thought he was just living on his retirement, and he still had a family he had to support. I'm sure that his, you know, when his kids got older, they lived in Germany.
Mhm.
I don't know. I respected it. I thought I didn't realize the church was giving him a salary.
Mhm. Yeah, and the mission presidents too. They pay mission presidents a lot of money.
Oh, that's interesting. I had, sorry, one more side note
You're
on my
good.
mission. So when I went on my mission, the first day you arrive in Tallahassee, and then you meet with the mission president, and then the mission president's wife invites the missionaries into their home for dinner. So we had dinner. I thought that was great. And then, we're on a tight budget. I think my monthly stipend was 150 a month to live as a missionary,
This
and
was in the
which,
70s, though.
yeah,
Right.
and then the assistants of the presidents come to us that morning as we're getting ready to get on our bus to our assigned areas, and said, "You need to kick in some money to pay for dinner last night." I Okay, gave a few bucks.
Oh, man. Okay. Yeah, it's so many struggles with what's going on financially, the things that the church hides. So, I do want to kind of pivot back to what you were saying about eternal marriage. So, you discussed how that was a struggle. Are we still married for eternity? Tell me a little bit about your beliefs in that now and kind of how have you come to the conclusions that you've come to on that?
Well, I like to think the way Wendy explains it, that God is a loving God, and if we're faithful to each other in this life, that God will let us be together, hopefully as husband and wife in the hereafter. I don't know what the hereafter is going to be. The church doesn't know what the hereafter is going to be. They tell us, but we don't know for sure until we get there. And so that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that we've lived a good enough life, that we've led a lifestyle that's pleasing to Christ and our Heavenly Father, and we'll be together in the hereafter.
Yeah. That's what I believe. Yeah. What
Mhm.
about
So,
yourself?
yeah, so for me, I believe so I just got married, as most everyone knows who watches my channel, and so
Congratulations.
thank you, and so that was a huge question that everybody was asking, "Do you believe in eternal marriage?" And so I believe that if we belong to Jesus and we are sealed to Jesus, and what is eternal with him, meaning our relationship will be eternal with him, and then we have a spouse that, we're married, and if we belong to Jesus, we belong to each other eternally as well. And so, like, if we are
Yeah.
one with God and we are doing the best we can to live the gospel and follow Jesus together, that's what makes for an eternal marriage. I don't believe that God condones divorce even in the afterlife. There's no way that he gives us just these beautiful blessings of the people we have in our lives and then it's just gone in heaven. I just don't feel like that is of the nature of God. And so I do believe that what breaks up marriages, though, in this life is sin. And that if you are
Yeah.
unfaithful to your spouse or committing grievous sin, that those are the things that break ceilings. And so if you want to be bound in heaven, then live the life aligned with Jesus Christ that makes it so that you will be with your person for eternity. And there's always repentance for things that happen, and
Yeah.
that's but I think that for the most part, live the way God wants you to with your spouse, and you will be together for eternity. And it's hard because in the temple, we're just taught that you're sealed to your spouse, and I see so many women staying in abusive marriages because they're sealed. They're sealed to that
Yeah.
guy, and I just don't believe that's how God functions. I just
No.
don't
Yeah.
believe it. So.
Yeah.
Which also kind of drifts into the family as an eternal unit as well. And
Mhm.
so we've experienced that with our kids. Our kids drifted away from the church while they were still kind of in our home,
Yeah.
growing up in
Yeah.
their later teens. And even though we were still living the gospel and trying to set a good example for them, you realize that the sealing of the family isn't a promise, even though you've done that in the temple. And it doesn't guarantee that you'll be a family unit in the hereafter. And so that was difficult too for us as our kids drifted away.
I tell you, I there was a little bit of a relief that when that was one of the things that, even though I wanted the church to be true, I had to start realizing, when I realized, okay, Wendy, no matter how much you want it to be true, it's not true. And I had to start looking, okay, what are the positives of it not being true? Number one, I didn't have to wear the uncomfortable underwear anymore, and didn't have to get judged when I didn't wear it. And the other one was that, I always felt guilty because my boys didn't go on missions. None of my kids got married in the temple. They really were not, as young adults, they didn't believe in the church. And there was always this guilt. The church always says, well, the parents, weren't doing something. They blame the parents. And so this was this additional layer of shame, because our kids, even as adults, didn't go to church anymore. And it was almost just a public kind of shaming. And so the relief that I had when I realized the church wasn't true was, I don't need to worry about that anymore. I really think if God loves us, and I believe he does, I think part of the reason you become a parent is because you start to have some understanding of what unconditional love is, because you understand that why God would love you unconditionally, even with all of your flaws, because you love your children unconditionally. And, they do things that you don't want them to do, that you disagree with. They say things, especially when they're going through their teen years, they say things that are really hurtful and disrespectful, and they're still your children, and you still love them. And so I think that, if you and your kids want to be together in heaven, I think God's going to let you. There are some people who don't want to be with their families for eternity. And I thought about that as a member of the church, when they would dangle this carrot, but you want to be in the celestial kingdom with your family. And I had some family members, that I thought, or in his family in particular, I thought, I don't know if I want to be with all of those people forever. I wouldn't mind seeing them once in a while, but I don't know that I want to live with them for eternity. So
It has everything to do with, just my opinion is that it has everything to do with Jesus, and that at the end, Jesus is who seals us. And so
yes,
if we desire that, and if Jesus seals us by the Holy Spirit of promise, then we are sealed to him and then sealed to each other. And I think that's what makes the difference.
I totally agree with that.
Mm-hmm. And there's no downplaying of, it's funny because I'm in Utah. So people ask me, did you get married in the temple? And I'm always like, oh, we just got married civilly, which is horrible to say the just in there, because I know that Jesus was present at our wedding, and that the Spirit was so strong, and that Jesus is going to seal us his. It's just, there's no doubt in my mind. But the culture of the LDS Church is like, it's less important because it's not in the temple. And that's really bad, really.
Yeah.
If I were you, I would say we had a very spiritual wedding, and it was beautiful. And we felt the Spirit of Christ when we were married. And I would leave it at that.
Exactly. And that's what I'm learning. I'm realizing, I can say that. And we're all peeling stuff off still. And so it's very interesting to see how people downgrade that. And think about how many people have not been married in a temple that probably have wonderful marriages.
Exactly. Well, we don't have the Mormons don't have a corner on the market of happy marriage. In fact, I would say they're the same as everybody else, really.
The divorce rate is the same. The divorce rate.
That's true.
Yeah.
So Wendy and I were married civilly in my parents' backyard in Denver, Colorado. It was a beautiful ceremony, a beautiful day. It was more beautiful than the sealing that took place a few months later in the temple.
Yeah.
So.
And the one we celebrated was always the civil one. So.
For sure. Okay, so you guys had all these awakenings and all these experiences. Any other points that you guys want to hit on about your awakening journey, things you want to discuss?
One thing that I would say is, since we've been out of the church, we still go back every now and then. In San Antonio, we still went to one of the wards in San Antonio. Actually a few of the different wards in San Antonio, because it's highly concentrated there. and would just introduce ourselves as visitors. And we've done the same here in England. We visited a couple different wards here in England because it's still comfortable.
Yeah.
It's what we grew up with, and we like the
The
songs.
songs are familiar for the most
And
part.
and so we always introduce ourselves as visitors. But we've also been to some magnificent, beautiful architectural wonders of churches that were built 1,000 years ago or 500
Here
years
in
ago.
England, yeah.
In England, we've been to the Notre Dame. We've been
Yeah.
to all kinds
The
of.
Vatican. As a Mormon, I always wondered about that. If our church is the one and only true church, why do other people have spiritual manifestations of their own church as being the true church? And again, now I think about it and realize that God listens to everybody's prayers, and God loves everyone. And I think He's happy when people are attending church and trying to do good things. And as long as they're trying to do good things, I don't think it really matters what church you go to.
I think that it has to do with, is Jesus in the heart of the individuals? And so people tell me all
Yes.
the time, Jesus is still in the LDS Church. My answer to that is, this is true because he's in the hearts of certain individuals, but then there are many individuals that he is not in the heart of.
Yeah.
And so it's all about the individuals. And so we can find Jesus anywhere. And so if
Yep.
we're seeking for Jesus, he's going to come and meet us where we're at. And I think his hope is that he doesn't leave us where we're at, and he wants us to grow with him into the next place that we need to be.
Yeah.
And so that's what we should all be seeking for. And I don't think it's a terrible thing to go visit other churches, to have experiences, and the Spirit will guide you. If that's not a place you should be, like, the Spirit will guide you. So,
I agree.
Yeah, we're
Yeah.
going to be visiting one on Saturday tomorrow. It's an
Mhm.
old 1200. Well, it's built around 1200 AD, but
Georgian style.
yeah, Fountain Abbey. It's earlier than Georgian, but
Oh, is it? Yeah, I
yeah.
suppose it is.
So it's going to be a beautiful place, and the architecture alone is all uplifting, kind of like we focus on our temples with the steeples. But it's very inspiring just to see the craftsmanship and the focus on building a structure that glorifies God.
for sure. Okay. So this kind of pivots into, what else are you guys doing to navigate your spiritual life now? What does that look like for you besides, going and visiting different churches? What are you doing to navigate your relationship with God?
Well, I still pray.
Mhm.
When you have children, even when they're adults, you worry about them. So I do a lot of prayer. I have been thinking lately that I need to do more reading of the Bible, because the Mormon Church didn't really focus on that as much. It wasn't that we avoided the Bible, but it was really very focused on the Book of Mormon. And I don't say that that's a bad thing, because it's still studying Scripture, and you're still trying to learn how to worship. But I think that's going to be something that I'm going to be working on, is just more Bible study, and uh, becoming more familiar with the history in the Bible and the New Testament.
And here at work, I don't know if I told you about this, but we have a Christian group, and we're doing the Hebrews study right now. So you find that everywhere you go, or everywhere we've traveled, there's always a good, strong Christian group somewhere. Even in North Carolina,
Yeah.
we went to a friend's church that we've known for years. And about back when we were devout Mormons, so they were surprised when we showed up at their service. But
Yeah.
it's
There's a lot of good people going
Yeah.
to small churches, and so it's nice to, I think when we get back to North Carolina too, we'll do more of going to some of the local churches and finding places where we can be of service. I really think that was the example that Christ gave, was that we're supposed to be serving each other. And I think that's why we're here, to build relationships with family and children, and our community. And when you build those relationships, you become aware of needs that people have, and they become aware of needs that you have. And that's, I think, what we're supposed to be doing. So that's what we will be doing more of when we get home, and it's what we try to do here as well in England. We have, because we're here, there are other Americans. We have friends that just got here. They have two little girls. They're about our kids' age, really. This couple that came, and So, we're helping them. We help watch their kids so that they can go and get things done, because there's all kinds of administrative things that you have to do when you first get here if you're supporting the work out here. The US government and the British government have a co
Partnership.
partnership. Yeah. So they're here to support that, as my husband is. And so yeah, so we look for ways to help in the community. I participated in the toy drive, the children's toy drive, helped coordinate where they go and all the things that are involved in sorting toys for different age groups and things like that. So I'm just looking for ways to be of service, and it's kind of fun, because when you do that, you meet people, you develop relationships, and you find that there really are a lot of really good, nice people, and they're not necessarily members of any church. Some of them go to church and some don't, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're being kind to each other and you're helping each other. And even if it's just meeting somebody for lunch and giving them some personal interaction because they're at home all day by themselves with nothing to do.
Mhm. And that alone is a concept that, like, in the LDS Church, it's like this is not a spoken teaching, but there is a lack of understanding that even just going to be with somebody because you want to, not because you were
Not
assigned
because
to,
you were
Yeah.
assigned. Exactly.
that's so healing for people. And Jesus told us to feed his sheep. And if you've done it for the least of these, you've done it for me, for God. And so that's what we should be remembering across all religions, all groups, all people, all communities. Service is the biggest thing that I think the world is getting colder and colder on. And we just need to be
Yeah.
looking outward. That's the God, that's big part of the gospel, is caring for other people. So I
Agreed.
think that's awesome.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I think those opportunities are really everywhere.
Yes,
But I
really, they
think you
are.
do you do, and it's easier when you get to be our age, because we're not quite as busy as when we were raising children.
Mhm.
You and your husband are young. You're developing your careers. You're trying to get financially secure. You may or may not have children, but if you do, you're going to be really busy with that.
Mhm.
For us, like we went to lunch today at one of the local pubs here, and there was an older couple at the table right behind us in their 80s, and I don't remember how we started talking, but I think they were ordering dessert, and his wife kind of looked over at Dan and said something, and we started talking to them. And they're in their 80s, but they're still fairly active and moving around. And I think we talked to them for a good half hour. And her husband is partly blind in one eye, like he only has 25% of his vision, and the other eye he doesn't have any vision. But
Mm.
I think they appreciated having somebody sit and talk to them for a
Yep.
half an hour about different things. And them being British and us being American, we struck up a good conversation. And they told us where they lived and said, come by sometime. I mean, they don't even really know us other than just that short half-hour conversation in the restaurant. And
Mhm.
So we talked about afterwards how we need to make it a point to actually go and visit them and spend some time
yeah,
with them.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think that's some awakening that I think everybody in this world could have, is just go visit people, love people, care about people. Everybody's suffering right now. Everybody in one way or another. And so
yeah.
people need people, and God gave us the gift to be able to love each other. And so that's a huge part of the gospel. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, guys, so let's kind of wrap this episode up. I want you to share with us kind of how, like, what is your relationship with Jesus Christ like now? You kind of talk about some of the things you're doing to live the gospel, but what about your relationship with Jesus? What's your testimony there?
Well, we've been to the Holy Land, so we've been to Golgotha, we've been to the Sepulchre, we've been to
Garden of
Garden of
Gethsemane.
Gethsemane. Excuse me. And you feel the Spirit there. You really do. And in fact, in the Garden of Gethsemane, it brought me to tears. And you just feel that in the sepulchre, the same thing. But just going through Jerusalem and walking the steps that the Savior, the points of the cross, but I don't know if you've heard of that or not, but and places where he ministered. It's just fascinating. We've been on the Sea of Galilee, so we have a very strong testimony of Christ and his ministry. And there's no doubt in our mind that he served there. There's evidence of his ministry
Yeah.
there. And that's what we are holding on to. We're holding on to the fact that he's our Savior, that we're children of God, and that we have a divine purpose. We know that we have been very blessed in our lives, and we want to bless others as well. And I know that that's what Christ wants us to do. So that's how we lead our life, and we want to continue to be examples of Christ's life.
Yep.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yep.
Wendy, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's pretty much what I would have said. Yeah.
Okay. That's beautiful. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your story. So cool to hear just a unique story. I mean, you guys have been all over and you live in the UK, and that's unique. And so thank you for coming on. I want to hear from both of you. How do you find clarity in your life now? Wendy, let's start with you. How do you find clarity?
Well, I think just having come to the realization that there isn't just one true religion. If there is, I haven't found it. So, clarity for me really came when I learned that the Mormon church is not the way, certainly not the only way. It might be a way to eternity, but I find clarity in the fact that Christ is the way. That's it. It's so easy. Honestly, it's that simple. And I remember saying that many times that, as I was realizing that I'd been lied to, there were a lot of things that really weren't true. And I just remember thinking, I'm pretty sure that it's simple. It's simple. And it needs to be simple because we're all at different intellectual levels and spiritual levels and emotional levels. So I think Christ made it simple. I think God made it simple.
Mhm.
It really is. It's just be kind and center your life on Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would agree with that too, Claire, that having a knowledge of the gospel, of our purpose in life and the life of the Savior certainly provides clarity when we have so many distractions in the world.
Hmm.
And we've seen it. We spent time in the war zone, both of us have.
Yeah.
And we see what chaos is like, and we see how many people are just driven and tossed and torn because of all these distractions. So I'd say the gospel certainly gives us clarity, but for me, Wendy is my clarity. She helps stabilize me, and she helps provide a good understanding of what's really important in life.
And that really goes both ways. That's the way I feel about Dan as well.
Yeah, well, and you feel there's this relationship that we have as we get closer to Christ, we naturally get closer to each other in our marriages. And that's just how it is. And I know that there's lots of people don't do idolatry with your spouse. Like, don't idolize it's not about
Yeah.
idolizing your spouse. It's about when you have a relationship with Jesus, you know how to love your spouse the way that Jesus would want you to. And so
Yeah.
You
then we
Yeah.
help each other in that journey. And then it goes back to what you said, Wendy. Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. And he gives us this blessing of family to be able to navigate these things together. So I think that's your overall message. Would you guys agree with that?
Totally.
Yep.
Yep.
Mhm.
Thanks so much for doing the podcast. I'm glad we came across you.
It was very nice meeting you and talking to you. We really appreciate the time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your story. It's been a pleasure, guys.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.
If you guys are interested in sharing your story of how you left mainstream religion to follow Jesus Christ, please feel free to reach out to me at clarity.podcast@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram now at The Clarity Podcast. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning into this week's episode of The Clarity Podcast.